Hey all, welcome back. Today I want to discuss a couple books that I've been reading for some background and context to my Ovid project, but that I think are actually very interesting to anybody interested in the early Roman Latin poets, any or all of them. Because while we will be looking at a speculative biography specifically of Ovid in the second part of this video, I want to start with Poets in a Landscape by Gilbert Hyatt, which covers no fewer than 7 of these great Latin poets, dedicating a chapter to each of them. We have Ca-TUL-lus, Virgil, Propertius, Horace, Tibullus, Ovid, and Juvenal. And all of them, with the exception of the last, are kind of lived in the same time period, the same 2 or 3 generations, like 50 to 70 years. It's, of course, a very interesting time where the Roman Republic was overthrown by Julius Caesar, and then we had a wartime, the Civil War, and then Octavian became Augustus, the first Roman emperor. So this transition from the from the late Roman Republic to the early empire. And actually, when you think about it, besides Ovid, the majority of these guys were wartime poets. They were writing during that Civil War period. And Ovid is also the youngest of all of them. So in a way, he's the one that has the advantage, I suppose, of being influenced or writing against or subverting or transforming the styles and works of all the others. And so for myself, it's been really interesting, but also, for anyone who wants to know or to get a picture of the whole Roman poetry and art scene, I suppose literature scene of the time, this is an awesome book. And the style is kind of unique as well, because while each chapter does do kind of a mini speculative biography of each poet, a little analysis of their style and works, it also ends each section with a sort of, in a way, poetic exploration of the landscape that would have influenced this poet, whether it be the town where they were born, the place that they had their kind of writer's retreat, getaway sort of thing. And I will say that while I found the majority of them enlightening, this book, I found it informative, engaging, like really awesome. I can't recommend it enough, but I'm also really frustrated and annoyed by some things in it. So all these things can be true at once. But the main thing is I was really disappointed in the Ovid section in particular, and by even my own reading of him feel that it was, but that's fine. But it did make me question a little bit how much like authors who are writing sort of speculative biographies about these poets that lived 2,000 years ago are like projecting things onto these poets and just kind of creating a narrative out of nothing. In a way, it's more of a creative work to imagine the life of this person, and it's almost impossible that any 2 or 3 people writing a book like this would come up with the same sort of narrative as the other. So, but I will say, like, just going through them, it really did at least give me some kind of idea of where these poets stood. Like Virgil, of course, is one of the first in here. Virgil being just sort of the archetypal, this was the guy who all of the others like looked up to, even, the critical and high standards. Horace was like shy in the presence of Virgil, so to speak, and like it's now and then we have like Ca-TUL-lus, Propertius, and Tibullus, who all sort of had their own take on the love elegy and kind of evolved it. So with Ca-TUL-lus, being the first chapter in this book, we get just this really raw type of love elegy, all focused on one woman. Basically, his whole career of poetry was focused around one woman. And then we get to Propertius, and Tibullus, who start to expand it a little bit more, but then almost start to detach a little bit. So you kind of see this cycle in almost every type of art, like music or whatever, how a thing evolves. You can see the love elegy evolve in Roman times from this very like pure and sincere thing to then becoming progressively more detached and self-aware. And then by the time we get to Ovid, Ovid is almost satirizing the love elegy in Amores, but not quite, until he arguably moves to full satire in his Art of Love. And then Juvenal, like some time after these guys, was full on satire. So just seeing how every sort of type of art tends toward this evolution, and it also makes me think of this idea of like, you can see the decline of a society by how satire and irony, which I guess are different things, but start to kind of form this picture of a society eating itself, a culture eating itself. And so you can see that sort of play out in Roman love elegies as it develops. And then I also quite enjoyed, I thought the chapter on horror, it was interesting because as I was moving through this book, Gilbert Hyatt writes so convincingly about each of the, and this is the thing that kind of annoyed me a little bit, is how authoritative his writing kind of comes off. Like it just has this feeling of like his narrative is the narrative about how people perceive these poets, if they're sophisticated or not, he's very opinionated. It comes off in a way about these poets and his idea about them. And this became the most obnoxious to me when we get to Ovid. But first I want to say that I got the sense that his favorite of these poets was Horace. It's one of the longest chapters, and he kind of just spends the most time in that chapter just waxing over how incredible and diverse and sophisticated Horace's writing style is. Which is great. I actually got really interested in it, and actually now I would say of all of these, if I were to read another Latin poet's entire works after Ovid, it would probably be Horace. He seems really quite interesting, and an interesting life too, being somebody who was the descendant of freed slaves, and then his father basically paid for him to get an education, did everything he could so that his son could have an education and then thrive and be somebody in Roman society. Just from the little I know of him, I'm a little bit questioning like what he did with that. But that's kind of the interesting part about getting to know all these poets is seeing their relationship to Augustus, because the relationship of each of these poets to the Roman emperor, or whether it be Julius Caesar, if we go back a little bit, or Augustus, is really fascinating, because none of them are quite completely anti-emperor. And if you were, your poetry probably wouldn't have survived. I don't know. But I think of all of them, Horace and Ovid were probably the most subversive, as what I could tell, potentially subversive. But even there's some questions about this. And I think I'm going to get into that later when I discuss one of the essays in that other Cambridge companion to Ovid, how Ovid had a pretty important his work had a pretty important relationship with the empire, as far as the dominance of Rome is what he saw and wrote and said, as long as Rome has conquered all lands, my work will live in fame. So the fame and the lasting power of Ovid's works, and arguably all of these poets, is due to the dominance of Rome as an empire. I'm not making a moral judgment on that. It just simply, they saw it for what it is. It's a relationship that exists. So the thing that particularly annoyed me about the Ovid chapter in this book is it's the shortest one for the Roman poet of all of these that had the largest oeuvre of all of these. And Also, I feel that his narrative about Ovid, his sort of the way he fits Ovid into his personal narrative of the Roman poets, is incredibly reductive. And it's natural that I would feel this way as I'm reading his entire works in depth, and he's one, obviously, that got me into the Latin poetry completely. So, like, he calls Ovid the most sensual and sophisticated of the Roman poets, but then kind of proceeds to focus almost entirely on his love elegies. So, the Amores, Heroides, and the Art of Love. Well, virtually, ignoring the entire and dismissing the second half of his career, where we get the Metamorphoses, Fasti, we get and he dismisses almost completely the exile poetry as just pathetic letters, which I know for a fact other authors who talk about Ovid, like in the Cambridge Companion, and here will say that is a very reductive way to look at those exile letters. And he also kind of he fits Ovid into this narrative of like declining morality in Roman society, and this when juxtaposed with like Virgil. His sort of waxing about Virgil and how Virgil had good reason to say good things about the Emperor Augustus, because the Emperor Augustus was the man who brought order and like was trying to improve morality. It's this very like conservative moral narrative viewpoint that this author seems to take some stock in. Which I don't know to what level you say that's true, but I'm just reminded at how much history, like people try to build these narratives of history, but they're always so reductive. And there's actually a particular line in here that I don't really know how to take. And I mean, Augustus in his personal life wasn't exactly the paragon of morality either. I think that is noted. But I just couldn't help questioning a little bit that narrative. And so when he's talking about Ovid's exile, he's kind of painting it in a way that Ovid was this poet that wrote with no morality. Now, Ovid, I guess he says, claimed to be somebody who, while he wrote about some shocking things and was kind of intentionally dealing with the most inflammatory emotions and situations in his works, claimed to be like a stand-up person, a good person in Roman society. And of course there's the mystery of his exile and everything that a lot of speculation here goes to saying it was because of his Art of Love. Now, Ovid writes Carmen et error. That's what a song and an error is what got him exiled. I don't know that he ever specifically says it's the Art of Love that gets him exiled. Maybe I'll find that out later, but this is the only time that I've actually read somebody say the specific poem that they thought got Ovid exiled. So that points again to sort of my one issue with the book, is that I feel the author is just too confident in his narratives and some of his speculations. And I think actually a nice contrast to that is this Young Ovid, A Life Recreated by Diane Middlebrook, which I really enjoy, even though it was sadly unfinished because the author had severe health issues and was unable to complete the project before her passing. But we have here a half-finished, like it was originally going to be an entire speculative biography of Ovid, just kind of based on psychological analysis from his poems. That's kind of the approach that Middlebrook was taking, and also the things that he writes about his own life in his poetry. So the really contradictory thing about Ovid is like he writes a lot of autobiographical stuff about himself in his works, but never actually takes the time. But he also like leaves us with a lot of huge questions. Like for all the little tidbits we have, he doesn't like tell us a lot about any of his three wives directly, or which actually there's a part of this book that speculates whether Corina in the Amores that gets like a third of the poems is actually his first wife, and she does it well. She doesn't say that this is definitively the way it is. She says that this is speculation. She is the author is always reminding us that she is building. She uses maybe, it's possible. It's not this like defined narrative, and also so these tidbits that Ovid leaves about his life are just kind of like left with these massive gaps, and it's like, why wouldn't you tell us, for example, directly why you were exiled, which leads to speculation about his exile. So there's just all this interesting stuff, and so using Ovid's own writing, she speculates about how he grew up, and really interesting. Ovid was actually born in the same month that I was, which is cool, and he was born exactly a year apart from his older brother, according to, so like he had the same exact birth date 1 year apart from his brother, and it speculates a bit how just from his writing we can gather that Ovid might have, as a young boy, spent a lot of time with like the women of the household. He was from like an upper middle class family that had an estate in like a rural area, but at the same time it was an upper middle class family that was really frugal. They really tried, they didn't like live as luxuriously as they could have. They there was probably horses, a lot of horses, horse raising around him, that he spent a lot of time overhearing the women of the estates kind of talking amongst themselves, and that maybe his mother was a very good storyteller. We get all this speculation backed up with lines and phrases from Ovid's works themselves, and also just historical knowledge of the time. The other thing, it did confirm that, at least I interpreted right, that part in the Amores where Ovid actually says that his family was part of the Polignes, a group of people that fought for their independence from Rome like 50 years before Ovid was born. But they didn't actually gain independence, but they gained Roman citizenship for all Italians, not just the city of Rome. So there was this sort of like pride, I guess, a potential pride in the past of like rebellion and kind of confronting the power of Rome a little bit in, I guess you would say just a troubled, conflicted relationship with Rome, wanting to be part of it, but also kind of rebelling against it, that, really you can see a lot of in Ovid's works, and you can't really take one side or the other completely. There's a glorifying of Rome, and there's also a subversion of it. And also, finally, what the chapter I found really fascinating was this marriage, divorce, vocation, and so Ovid, there's some thought here that one of Ovid's lines points to the fact that his second wife, unfortunately, he was not able to, share the bed with his second wife long, but we do know that he had a daughter by his second wife, and the speculation here is that perhaps his second wife died in childbirth, giving birth to the daughter. And his daughter was pretty much like, I guess, married off to a man with some wealth at an early age, I think I don't know if that's confirmed or speculation, it's written in here. And then his third his third marriage was basically his last one, and when he started writing the Metamorphoses, and really, I think, kind of entered into sort of full maturity, and he would remain, I guess, married to her from a distance while he was in exile as well, and would write letters to her and write things about her and so on. So got at least a little bit of insight and speculation into these, the actual love life of Ovid beyond what he wrote. And it's very interesting that, to think that he himself, while writing this really, I guess you might call smutty stuff, but I actually think the Amores is much deeper than a lot of these authors are giving them credit for. It's so interesting because even in this Poets in a Landscape, Gilbert Hyatt says that the Heroides is a deeper and in more rich work than the Amores in some way, but I actually disagree. I think the Heroides is a little. I tend to agree with those people who wrote in the Cambridge Companion who say it's a little bit more rhetorical and artificial. It's still great and it still has passion and emotion, but again, you're just to repeat this sort of idea over 15 books, 15 different women all lamenting over men that have abandoned them or that they're waiting for or that are hurting, that their love is hurting them, to keep repeating this theme over and over is, to me, it's a little bit more stylistic over the actual going for a deeper substance to me. And that's where I feel like the Amores actually is this really intense struggle as an artist for Ovid over, the fact that he went back to it years later, right? And so anyway, I've kind of talked about these points in my previous videos, so I apologize for kind of summing and repeating those. Check out the previous videos on Amores and Heroides for that. So anyway, I think that's kind of what I wanted to share today. Just a little bit of context of the time of Ovid, kind of what I'm getting out of it. I'm not really done sort of thinking about this, and I'm really trying to avoid that particular solidifying a narrative in my head about Ovid or any of these poets or the time period or Augustus, because I'm just so aware that while it is interesting to try to construct possible narratives about history, once you give yourself over to one too much, it becomes, you start to bias yourself, and you start to get away from the true nature of just the mystery and the reality that we don't know. Reality is so much more complex than any simple narrative of history or even a person's life. Even if we could have all the information, like today, right? We have so much information about people that lived in the past 100 or 200 or 300 years, and yet people still can't agree about a narrative about their life and what their life meant. And so it's just, in the end, part of the fun of exploring the works of a poet from 2,000 years ago is never really knowing. And it's part of the fun of not fun, but just that's just life. That's truth. That's life. So thank you. We'll see you next time.